Welcome everyone to today's Indians session on geriatric psychiatry. Today's topic is late life bipolar disorders by Dr. Migita, who is a final year senior resident and DM student in geriatric psychiatry clinic and services at NIMHANS. This session is chaired by Dr. Y.C. Janardhan Reddy sir, who is professor of psychiatry and has done extensive research in bipolar disorders and also OCD from NIMHANS. So we welcome you both, Dr. Migita and Y.C. JR sir. Sir, before we start the session, could you speak a few words on this? Sir?
Thank you, Chetan. Thank you for the generous introduction. My extensive work in bipolar disorder seems to have come down a little bit in the recent years because of my preoccupation with OCD. But yes, you are right. I started off my work with bipolar disorder in children, actually, not even elderly population. Anyway, that aside, we have today presentation by Migita on late life bipolar disorder. You can also call bipolar disorder an elderly or a geriatric bipolar disorder, depending upon your liking. Generally, when we talk about bipolar disorder, the discussions usually center around, treatment of bipolar depression, maintenance treatment in bipolar disorder. Even if when we talk about treatment in a special population, the focus is mostly on children, adolescents, because of, the nature of the problem and peculiar kind of comorbidities that are unique to that age group, and also bipolar disorder in pregnancy, postpartum, and lactating mothers. At the most, we extend to discussing bipolar disorder and comorbid with substance abuse and alcohol abuse. Rarely ever we discuss late life bipolar disorder extensively. Now, to that extent, it also reflects that we have very little data on late life bipolar disorder. Now, late life bipolar disorder can fall into two groups. One is aging bipolar disorder patients. Bipolar disorder started when they were young, but it persists into late life. And people who have bipolar disorder manifesting for the first time after 50 or 60 years, which is usually called the late life. Now, the two groups are not necessarily the same, because late life bipolar disorder may have a different, etiological origins, and also poses different kind of management problems. In addition, you have problems of differentiating late onset bipolar disorder from other medical conditions as well. So the challenges in any case, when you have an elderly person with bipolar disorder, are very unique, basically because of medical comorbidities and the problems in using the existing pharmacological agents. Then you have a special problem of differentiating it from other degenerative disorders. And of course, the cognitive damage or cognitive deficits are much more obvious in elderly bipolar disorder compared to the young onset bipolar disorder. Now, I think Migita will try to cover all these areas in the time that she has. Migita?
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, everybody. I will be talking about what I like to call late life bipolar disorders, that are bipolar disorders in people about the age of 50. So what exactly are we talking about? Late life bipolar disorders is predominantly a topic of differentiation, because while the manifestations, management, even prognosis to a large extent may be similar to early life bipolar disorders or the classical bipolar disorders, there are certain key differences which occur with age, which are important to this population. So bipolar disorders, as defined by the National Institute of Mental Health, are a group of mental disorders which cause unusual shifts in mood, energy, activity levels, concentration, and even the ability to carry out day-to-day activities. So it isn't just the change in mood which is important, though that is at the core of the illness, but that is associated with changes in your behavior, activity, in your diurnal rhythm. And while we classically talk of the type 1, that are periods of mania and periods of depression, type 2 and cyclothymic disorders, that is mania, hypomania and depression, as well as subsyndromal mood fluctuations, all fall under the rubric of bipolar disorders. Bipolar type 2 and cyclothymia exist across the lifespan, continue to exist in the elderly, and the degree of underdiagnosis may increase with increasing age. So beyond what cutoff do we call disorders late life? Unlike, say, schizophrenia, where there is a fairly clear consensus that 40 to 45 is late onset schizophrenia, there isn't any clear differentiation between early life and late life bipolar disorders. In general, literature tends to take 50 years and above as a semi-arbitrary cutoff in most studies. But this is more a differentiation of convenience. Epidemiological studies, especially in the 80s, tended to divide period prevalence into people less than 50 and above 50. And therefore, 50 became a convention that was followed. Now, bipolar disorders which occur above the age of 50 can be, as I mentioned, of two types. The early onset disorders, what used to be called graduation. Somebody who's developed a bipolar disorder in their 20s to 30s and now has turned 50 to 60. Or late onset disorders, that are bipolar disorders which occur for the very first time above the age of 50. Now, the term is slightly contentious because there is a school of thought which says that perhaps the disorders above the age of 50, even though they have a similar manifestation, might actually be an entirely different disorder altogether. And an alternative term proposed by the Royal College of Psychiatrists is manic syndromes in old age, divided into primary manic syndromes that are the so-called functional disorders, where there is no clear underlying etiology, as well as the secondary manic syndromes, diseases of the brain, systemic diseases, drug-induced disorders, which present with mania above the age of 50. Now, how prevalent are bipolar disorders in late life? All across the world, there appears to be a fairly uniform consensus that about 1% of people living in the community have had one of the bipolar disorders at some point in their life. Approximately 90 to 95%, that is nearly all these people, usually have an onset in early life, before 50, leaving about 5 to 10% who have it about the age of 50. And when you look about the age of 60, it's even lower. It comes down to 0.1 to 0.5% of people in the community. But the prevalence varies with the settings, because once you come to the hospital, you find that late life bipolar disorders make up a relatively larger proportion of the bipolar presentations. 8 to 10% of older adults who visit the geriatric psychiatric clinic present with one of the bipolar syndromes. 14 to 17% of older adults who present to the psychiatric emergency settings. Whereas in inpatients about the age of 60 years, almost a quarter, that's 25%, are admitted for the management of a bipolar disorder. So what you can see is that while it might make up a relatively small fraction of the disorders which affect older adults, they consume a disproportionate amount of resources and seem to be more severe than you would expect in early life. Chronic institutionalization also seems to be associated with higher prevalence, predominantly because it is likely that these are either more severe or have more severe deficits, which require long-term residential care, or perhaps even the fact that there is very poor social support available for bipolar disorders in older age. There, as I mentioned, it's a lifetime prevalence of 1 to 2%, but annually about 0.1 to 0.7% of people above the age of 50 tend to have one of the bipolar syndromes. And as you can see, the prevalence reduces across the lifetime from 5.9% in young adults to 60 and above in older adults. The lifetime prevalence in India also follows literature across the world. The National Mental Health Survey in 2015 to 16 found a lifetime prevalence of bipolar disorders of 0.5%, out of whom 0.3% currently had one of the presentations. The age stratified prevalence also showed that there tended to be prevalence of less than 1% as age increased. That was approximately 0.55% from 50 to 59 and 0.56% about the age of 60. So why the discrepancy in rates? Why do we find only 0.1% of people about the age of 50 having bipolar disorders? Because if it affects 1% of the general population, you would expect this group to carry the illness with them as they age, predominantly because it is a lifetime disorder. There was initially speculation about whether a burnout happens, that is, people with early onset bipolar disorder might stabilize, might go into remission, stop having episodes, or have less frequent episodes as they grow older. However, we now have conclusive studies, at least from the Anglophone countries, which have followed up people over 50 to 60 years and found that a burnout is not really the norm. Most people who have an early onset bipolar disorder continue to have episodes in late life. Another reason possibly was that there might be an increased mortality rate in early life because of death of suicide, death of other non-communicable diseases such as the metabolic syndrome, which has a very high comorbidity, as you would know, with bipolar disorder. But a much more likely explanation is that it's likely to be a treatment gap. All over the world, the treatment gap which exists for BPAD is above 50%. The National Mental Health Survey in India found a treatment gap of 70.4% just for the bipolar disorders. And it is likely that as people grow older, the treatment gap is going to widen, simply because it's going to become more difficult to come to the hospital with challenges to mobility and increased dependency. So the clinical presentation is not really very different from what you would see in younger adults, but I will focus on the differences. As people grow older, the manic episodes seem to be less frequent. They also appear to be less severe. And manic episodes tend to be associated with lesser psychotic symptoms. Further, when a person with a bipolar disorder attains remission about the age of 50, they are much more likely to have a risk of relapse of depression rather than mania. Now, this might seem like a semantic difference, but it's very important in management because here, this is a population where you might safely want to give an antidepressant to prevent further relapses. The risk of a subsequent manic relapse is very, very low. They are much less likely to experience psychotic symptoms in the manic episode. However, if they have a depressive episode, they are much more likely to experience psychotic symptoms. And very interestingly, there seems to be a relatively long gap between a depressive episode and a manic episode. So if an older adult has had, say, a depressive episode, you can expect at least 17 years to pass on average before they have another manic episode. Again, something which gives you a relative amount of safety in the use of an antidepressant. However, importantly, they are much more likely to experience rapid cycling. An alternate possibility is that because of incomplete remission, there might be more frequent both relapses and recurrences occurring during the year. They are less likely to attempt suicide based upon epidemiological data. However, once a suicide is attempted, it is much more likely to be lethal in older adults. Unlike our data in India, where it shows about 60% of people with bipolar disorder tend to be men, data across the world at least seems to show that there is a female preponderance in all affective disorders, depressive as well as bipolar disorders. Now, the female preponderance tends to increase in late life. So you can expect about 69% of older patients with BPAD to be women, as compared to 55% of younger patients. There might be two reasons to this. One, the estrogen hypothesis that menopause leads to the withdrawal of estrogen, which is a protective factor against mental illnesses. Two, women live longer. Women often outlive men and outnumber men as they grow older. And the fact that there are more women alive might simply mean that they are more likely to develop a bipolar disorder. However, late-life bipolar disorders are much less likely to have social support once they fall sick. And the same severity of an illness can cause greater amount of morbidity and mortality. There's a much greater burden of residual disability, even in remission. And they're much more likely to have comorbid vascular, neurological, and many other medical conditions, all of which require caution in management. Cognitive deficits, again, can be both static and progressive. So what are differences based upon the age of onset of the disorder? If you compare older adults with an early onset to those with a late onset, early onset are much more likely to be similar to the younger adults. That is, they will have probably a severe manic or depressive episode, whereas late life is likely to have a milder manic episode and a more severe depressive episode. Early onset bipolar disorders usually associated with euphoric mania, whereas late onset with dysphoric mania. Late onset disorders also seem to have a relatively better prognosis. They don't seem to require as much time to resolve or as much time in the hospital once admitted. It was expected that one would not find a lot of family history late onset. However, interestingly, almost 24 to 88% of people with a late onset bipolar disorder actually do tend to have family history. However, family history is much more likely in the early onset. Again, the comorbidities are something you see in both the ages of onset. However, late onset are more likely to have comorbidities and more likely to progress to dementia. Now, if you look at the early onset bipolar disorders, what you can see as they grow older is a neuroprogression. That is changing from the asymptomatic stage to subsyndromal symptoms to the first episode, followed by a period of remission, relapse, multiple relapses, and eventually treatment resistance. Now, there are multiple ways to stage neuroprogression. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly how and at what ages people pass through this as they grow older. However, what you can definitely expect is that in people who have had an early onset disorder and are now growing older, as they grow older, they are likely to progress from a stage 0 to a stage 8. And this is going to be associated with an increase in many markers of progression, such as increase in the BDNF, decrease in the BDNF levels, increase in inflammatory markers, all of which might account for why treatment resistance seems to increase and why cognitive deficits seem to occur more commonly as people go older. Now, if you look at just the late onset disorders, most of them appear to be people who have had recurrent depressive episodes in early life and have now quite soon developed a manic episode. So, literature found that between 1 to 26 years often lapse between the recurrent depressive episodes and the onset of a new manic episode. On the other hand, 20% of people who develop BPAD above the age of 50 for the first time seem to have both manic and depressive episodes appearing at the same time, at above 50. And another 20% seem to have only manic episodes. Association with comorbidities is our major concern in this demographic group. One can expect a very high lifetime prevalence of substance use disorders, predominantly alcohol and nicotine, simply because of ease of access. However, what is heartening is that the degree of comorbidity is lesser in an older adult as compared to a younger adult. So while 48% of younger patients with a bipolar disorder might have a substance use disorder, only 29% of people above the age of 50 with a BPD diagnosis tend to use substances. Alcohol, again, is the most common, with a prevalence of 38.1% of all comorbidities. You might also find comorbid panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, dysthymia, other disorders on the neurotic spectrum, which also merit treatment if present. A personality disorder is fairly highly comorbid, that is 53%, but this is only slightly more than younger adults because younger adults with BPD also tend to have a 10 times higher risk of developing a personality disorder as compared to younger people without a bipolar disorder. Now, there was an initial hypothesis again saying that the longer somebody has a diagnosis of BPAD and the longer they are likely to be on antipsychotics, the more dopaminergic blockage that might happen and the occurrence of a secondary or even a primary Parkinson's disease could be expected. However, studies which have looked at the incidence of Parkinson's in late onset BPAD has not found an increase. Despite this, what you can see are that all neurological disorders seem to be more common in older adults with BPAD. About 23.1% have some sort of neurological disorder, the most common being peripheral neuropathies. And again, people who have had a late onset bipolar disorder tend to have more neurological disorders than a late onset unipolar disorder, indicating that there is something about the bipolarity itself rather than just the aging process, which predisposes them to neurological disorders. Vascular disorders are, however, the highest cause of concern, predominantly because BPAD seems to have double the odds of stroke when compared to age and education match controls, and this seems to persist over a prospective follow-up of 6 to 10 years. They most commonly present with silent cerebral infarcts and previously undetected white matter hyperintensities. Now, a higher risk of stroke is also seen in unipolar late onset disorders, and this has led to the speculation that depression in late life might have a vascular etiology, what you call vascular depression. It is possible that there might be something similar called a vascular mania because up to 60% of older adults with BPAD tend to have some sort of cerebrovascular dysperfusion. You can actually also expect a higher body mass index compared to age-matched controls, particularly if it has been an early onset and somebody's been on anti-psychotics and other psychotropics for a long period of time. And a higher prevalence of systemic illnesses, endocrine, metabolic, respiratory, cardiac, and renal. Pekal, for example, goes on to speculate that hypothyroidism might occur in almost all older adults with BPAD. Apart from the manic and the depressive symptoms, however, what is concerning are the cognitive deficits in this demographic group, both while they're having an episode as well as while they're in remission. Cognitive impairment clearly occurs in 40 to 60% of patients when they are symptomatic. However, even when euthymic, cross-section studies found that over half of people with a late life BPAD scored less than 1.5 standard deviations based on age and education norms. What does this mean? It means that this group is more likely to have cognitive deficits in an episode and carry those cognitive deficits even after remitting. This is slightly different from early onset young adults, where they have a cognitive deficit initially during the episode, which seems to reduce in remission, but then later as time progresses tends to become more and more prevalent even in the periods of remission. Also, once a static deficit sets in, there also seems to be a progressive decline of cognitive function, which occurs in a subset of these people over years. In comparison to other disorders, you can see approximately the same amount of cognitive deficits in late life schizophrenia. That is 40 to 60% of people affected. However, this is much higher than in age-matched unipolar controls. The cognitive deficits affected are the ability to pay attention to a task, working memory, executive functions, calculation, abstraction, and motor initiative. This, however, can be differentiated from the changes which occur in healthy aging. In healthy aging, what you do see is a slowing of cognition. So people might take longer to process information, might find it difficult to pay attention to two things at the same time, or to shift attention. Fluid intelligence, as we know, tends to reduce with aging, while crystallized intelligence accumulates, and the capacity of working memory might reduce. However, you do not see the dysexecutive deficits that you expect in the late life bipolar disorder in healthy aging. So the presence of a dysexecutive syndrome is a very important marker indicating that there is already a cognitive deficit in this person, which is not age related. On the other hand, if you look at somebody who has a mild cognitive impairment and is predisposed to dementia, they are much more likely to have issues with learning and memory, and perhaps parieto-occipital skills. So what you can see is a pattern of anterior cerebral deficits in bipolar disorders compared to dementias where you have often posterior deficits. There is, of course, the question of dementia. There is an increased risk of developing dementia in people with BPAD when compared to healthy adults of the same age, even when matched for education. Up to 3 to 25% of older adults with BPAD tend to develop dementia when followed up over the lifetime. The predictors are a higher biological age, a lower number of years of education, the presence of a greater number of episodes, because the more episodes you've had, the more insult to the brain, and therefore the more accumulation of injury. A younger age at the first depressive episode, the prevalence of manic episodes, the presence of manic episode fairly recently. So the more likely you are to have manic episodes in late life, the more likely you also are to have a cognitive deficit. What are the protective factors? Obviously, the most important protective factors are non-specific. Taking care of vascular risk factors, reducing the risk of diabetes, hypertension, maintaining a normal body mass index. In addition, the optimal management of the disorder also helps prevent progression to dementia. Because when compared to people with late life BPAD who have never been treated, those on treatment are less likely to develop dementia. The use of both lithium and mood stabilizers in older adults with a bipolar disorder appears to reduce the likelihood of progression to dementia. One caveat with this is that a lot of this is based upon nationwide registries and therefore might not be as robust as data which comes from an interventional trial. Lithium has also found to improve executive functioning in older adults with bipolar disorder over 6 to 12 months of follow-up. However, the use of lithium does not seem to reduce the prevalence of cognitive deficits, merely just improves the degree of deficit. On the other hand, there have been drinking water studies which have indicated that the prevalence of higher lithium levels in drinking water in healthy communities tends to reduce the risk of dementia. The argument here, therefore, is that lithium seems to act somewhat as an antioxidant, reduce the amount of oxidative stress to the brain, and therefore protect the brain. However, lithium has not been found to be helpful in mild cognitive impairment, which is not related to BPAD. On the other hand, donepezil, a drug used for the management of dementia, has been tried in the cognitive deficits in BPAD and has not been found to be useful. So lithium and donepezil do not appear to have a crosstalk. What are the neuroimaging findings? One would expect to find greater atrophy in a late life bipolar disorder, but that does not seem to be the case. There are some studies which show atrophy, but some studies also do not show any differences. However, what are very clear are vascular changes. You are much more likely to have white matter hyperintensities show up on an MRI scan, particularly when they are frontal. These are important because the more hyperintensities you have, the more vascular injury, and the more likely you are to have a poor response to treatment or even treatment resistance. Silent infarctions also a tendency to have a larger temporal and hippocampal volume, which might explain why BPAD does not seem to cause difficulties in learning, and a smaller caudate volume, particularly in the right side. There is also a decrease in whole brain connectivity. There is a reduced fractional anisotropy seen in white matter across the brain, particularly in the corpus callosum. So while the brain might not be smaller, it is definitely not communicating as efficiently as you would expect. Also, with time, the hippocampus, the fusiform gyrus, and the cerebellum tend to lose some amount of gray matter. Now, functional imaging also tends to show reduced connectivity in all adults. Quite interestingly, most of the deficits tend to be right rather than left. Now, service utilization. As discussed already, people with late life bipolar disorders tend to use a much larger proportion of services when compared to younger adults with a bipolar disorder. There tends to be an average of at least 4 hospitalizations over 10 years. And they tend to use 4 times more outpatient services and almost 6 times more inpatient and emergency services when compared to younger people. Also, as mentioned, double the length of hospital stay. They are much more likely to be hospitalized at the first episode, which shows that even though a mania or hypomania in late life might not be very disruptive, it might be harder to manage this person on an OPD basis simply because of other comorbidities, of poor social support, and of the need to ensure the safety of the older adult. For example, in a Finnish study, 20% of all first-time hospitalizations with a manic episode were above 60. This obviously needs to be interpreted with caution because this is a country where there is demographic aging. What is the prognosis like? So, response and remission rates are not very different in older adults. On the other hand, once the remission is attained, we tend to have what is a very fragile remission, meaning that remission may be attained, but it is less easy to maintain this remission. One of the few studies in late life bipolar disorders in India found that even in people who had remitted over a year, the quality of life tended to be about 53.4, I'm sorry, which means that even in remission, there tend to be residual deficits. Of course, the greater the cognitive deficits, the greater the comorbidities, the more likely you are to have a poorer quality of life. However, even in people who do not have these risk factors, there seems to be a considerable burden of disability. Early onset disorders, once the early onset disorders progress to late life, that is, once they become older, you tend to see that about 16% recover, 26% continue to have impairment even during remission. 36% continue to have recurring episodes. 16% have a chronic course, and 7% have suicide. This is not very different from, say, the STAR*D trials, which found that less than half of the people who were treated for depression ever remitted. So, while a late life bipolar disorder might be more difficult to treat, the outcomes don't appear to be very different. However, once you do have an episode in your 50s, you are likely to have 10 or more episodes over your subsequent lifespan, and 56% of these episodes require hospitalization. This is in contrast to young adults, where only about 10% of episodes in the community need hospitalization. 30 to 50% of older adults with BPID tend to need a readmission within the next 3 to 7 years, meaning that even if the episodes may not be very disruptive, again, subsequent episodes are also difficult to manage. And there is again a much higher mortality rate, a 50% mortality rate 10 years later. This is compared to a 20% increase in mortality in unipolar depression. How is the management different? Potentially because one needs to evaluate for all the comorbidities which may exist as one grows older. Also to look for organic causes which may be more common in older adults. So the baseline workup for somebody who's presenting in their 50s to 60s with BPAD would, in addition to the usual investigations done, include a hemogram and coagulation profile, particularly because you're worried about the risk of thrombocytopenia and leukopenia with valproate and carbamazepine. So knowing what the counts are like at baseline helps you decide the choice of management as well as monitor potential adverse effects. Serum electrolytes, because again, hyponatremia is a very common adverse effect of most mood stabilizers in older adults. And liver and renal function, predominantly because it will help you differentiate between lithium, a renally excreted drug, and valproate, a hepatically metabolized drug, when choosing your mood stabilizer. Thyroid function tests, because hypothyroidism increases with age and is a very common comorbidity in BPAD. Also that hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism are risk factors for organic mood disorders. Knowing what the urine protein levels and the urine glucose levels are like at baseline, again, because lithium-induced nephropathies are much more common in older adults. And looking at the lipid and the glycemic profile and other vascular risk factors. Because while there may be comorbidities, it is the vascular risk factors which are most likely to kill a person. It is important to take, I think, a meticulous history and look at all the comorbidities again that a person may be having. A good idea is to do a pill check and to ask them to bring all the medicines that they're taking, Ayurvedic, homeopathic, allopathic, everything, and just look at everything. Particularly because they may be on steroids for arthritis, the treatment of tuberculosis. Interestingly, there are anecdotal reports of even non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like indomethacin and antibiotics like ciprofloxacin causing late onset bipolar disorder, which seems to resolve once the offending agent is withdrawn. Obviously, substance use disorders, as in younger adults. Looking at endocrine causes of mood symptoms such as hypothyroidism, Cushing's, Addison's disease. Also looking at other systemic infections, autoimmune conditions, which may also cause an organic mania. Neuroimaging is recommended in late onset bipolar disorders. So when someone comes to you in their 20s with BPAD, you might not want to do a CT or an MRI immediately. But in somebody at 50 to 60, it becomes a mandatory part of the workup. Predominantly because you want to rule out secondary manic symptoms, especially secondary manic symptoms which occur because of brain injury, such as organic head injury, infarcts, tumors, frontotemporal dementias, subcortical vascular dementias. Very interestingly, BPD does seem to be, to some extent, a product of CSTC, that is the cortical subcortical connectivity. So anything which causes a disconnectivity between the frontal lobe as well as the subcortex is much more likely to produce an elevated mood. And that might partially explain why you see a very facile euphoria in neurosyphilis, in herpes simplex encephalitis, in TB meningitis or in the frontotemporal dementias, even sometimes in the subcortical vascular dementias. But this is important to differentiate from the true BPADs, because what you do see classically is a non-communicable cheerfulness, and this is different from the communicable euphoria that you usually see in a primary mania. The choice of mode stabilizers is a very important question here. Lithium, of course, is the best studied drug in BPAD. However, the therapeutic window is narrow across the lifespan, and the adverse effects of lithium obviously tend to be much more prevalent in older adults. This is because there are very important pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic changes which occur with age. And so one of the things which occur with age is a decrease in body water, a decrease in subcutaneous fat levels. And this means that there's a lower volume of distribution. A lower volume of distribution means that lithium is spread across less water in the body. And therefore, even a small amount of dehydration might suddenly cause an increase in lithium levels and push the person into toxicity. So therefore, the vulnerability to lithium toxicity is much higher here. There's also lower clearance level, which means that the half-life of lithium increases to up to 36 hours by the 8th decade. So for someone in their 70s, you might not want to do a lithium level at day 5, but wait until day 7 to 8 instead. And interestingly, while our therapeutic goal for lithium is usually 0.6 to 1.2, lower plasma lithium levels of 0.2 to 0.4 milliequivalents might actually be sufficient. So when treating with lithium, it's a good idea to begin at a low dose, that is 150 to 300 mg. Uptitrate slowly once in 5 to 7 days after checking the serum levels. This is also important because lithium-induced adverse drug events are much higher even at therapeutic doses. So even within the therapeutic range, you're much more likely to see postural tremors, a Parkinsonian syndrome, hypothyroidism, renal dysfunction, and a sinoatrial block. A sinoatrial block predominantly when combined with digitalis and beta blockers. So if somebody has ischemic heart disease or an arrhythmia and is already on medication for the same, you might not want to combine that with lithium. A very common symptom which is underdiagnosed in older adults who are on lithium is fatigue and malaise, just because lithium tends to reduce the excitability of the muscles. The interactions are particularly troublesome with digitalis and beta blockers, where it can cause sinoatrial block in combination, and with AC inhibitors, thiazide diuretics, and NSAIDs, where there's a higher risk of renal dysfunction. Valproate is a slightly safer drug when compared to lithium, has a larger therapeutic window, but on the other hand, the hepatic interactions are much more, because they tend to inhibit CYP3A4 and 2D6. If you are giving valproate in combination with an antidepressant or a benzodiazepine, you can expect a higher level of the drug. Also, monitoring for adverse effects of valproate such as hyponatremia, thrombocytopenia, leukopenia, and gastritis. One of the benefits of valproate here is that most late onset BPDs are likely to be in menopause, and therefore the worries about teratogenicity and menstruation may not be as concerning a factor here. On the other hand, if you look at carbamazepine, again, it's an inducer of CYP3A4 enzymes, and therefore can lower the levels of any psychotropics which are co-administered. And these interactions are important to bear in mind in valproate and in carbamazepine, because valproate is likely to be associated with toxicity of other psychotropics, whereas carbamazepine is likely to make the other psychotropics less efficacious. Adverse drug events such as hyponatremia and leukopenia. Importantly, leukopenia is much more likely to occur in carbamazepine as compared to valproate. So unless you're able to monitor the counts regularly, you might not want to consider carbamazepine and go for valproate instead. The potential for neurotoxicity, especially peripheral demyelination, is much higher with carbamazepine than with valproate and lithium. There is some evidence for other anticonvulsive agents, such as lamotrigine, oxcarbamazepine, pregabalin, levetiracetam, and even benzodiazepines such as lorazepam. However, lithium and valproate are the only drugs in which we have at least level 2 evidence, that is from a small RCT. Antipsychotics can also be used for the management of BPAD, what is recommended here is that it be used as monotherapy. So unlike younger adults where you might want to combine a mood stabilizer with an antipsychotic, particularly if they come to you in a manic episode, using either a mood stabilizer or an antipsychotic alone may be sufficient in this group. The reason antipsychotics aren't a first line of management immediately in older adults because there's much higher risk of vascular comorbidities. There is a risk of falls, and there is at least robust longitudinal data showing that when people with dementia are treated with antipsychotics, there seems to be an increase in mortality. Now, we're not sure if this increase in mortality with antipsychotics in dementia extends to all people above 50, but it is a reason to be cautious. Antidepressants, again, antidepressants are not generally recommended in people with a BPAD, particularly because you're worried about whether a switch can occur or rapid cycling may occur. On the other hand, the major burden of a late life bipolar disorder is because of the depressive symptoms, not the manic symptoms. And therefore, you might want to consider an antidepressant under the cover of a mood stabilizer, particularly in a difficult depression. And in fact, some retrospective audits have found that up to 70% of people above 50 who have BPD tend to be on an antidepressant for a long period of time. However, once you look at rapid cycling older adults, they're much more likely to have antidepressants than non-rapid cyclers. Now, it's unclear whether it's a cause or effect. So a rapid cycling person may have more episodes and therefore have an antidepressant, or the antidepressant may itself have triggered the rapid cycling. What are the recommendations? The recent CanMat guidelines are the only guidelines which offer substantial treatment guidelines for late life bipolar disorders. The first line treatment for somebody in mania above 50 is lithium or valproate as monotherapy, primarily because we have level 2 evidence, that is evidence from an RCT. Second line, quetiapine, mainly because of the risk of cardiac mortality with antipsychotics, and other mood stabilizers and antipsychotics as third line. ECT is usually reserved for treatment resistance along with clozapine. In geriatric depression, the first line treatment, on the other hand, is an antipsychotic, quetiapine or lorazepam. Second line is lithium or lamotrigine. Third line, valproate, aripiprazole, and carbamazepine, and ECT in treatment resistance. Now, lamotrigine also has level 2 evidence of bipolar depression, though not in bipolar mania. The only limiting factor of lamotrigine is the need for a slow up titration. So starting at 25 milligrams and then increasing by 12.5 to 25 milligrams once in 2 weeks is recommended, with a target dose of 100 mg to 200 mg. Now, if the person you're seeing in OPD is somebody who can come back for regular follow-ups, stay in touch with you, and somebody you can monitor for the risk of rashes, lamotrigine is a good drug, and it is safer when compared to lithium and valproate in terms of neurotoxicity and other organic impairments. For maintenance, the best thing to do is to use whatever worked in the acute phase, either lithium, lamotrigine, or valproate. If an antipsychotic has been started during the acute phase, that is during a psychotic depression or a mania, it's recommended to taper and stop the antipsychotic intermission and maintain the person only on a mood stabilizer. For agitation, antipsychotics again are not preferred as first line for sedation, predominantly because of the risk of cardiac mortality. An oral or parenteral lorazepam is recommended by the EPA, with risperidone or olanzapine being second-line agents in a person who does not settle down with the benzodiazepine. Now, in somebody who does not take an oral drug to calm down, you might want to give a parenteral lorazepam. If lorazepam does not work parentally, an alternative would be parenteral haloperidol. But the idea being here that antipsychotics should be not immediately on your go-to list. There is also fairly robust evidence from small RCTs for cognitive behavioral therapy, family-focused therapy, interpersonal and social rhythm therapy, and even level 3 and 4 evidence for problem-solving therapy, as well as something called CAE, or customized adherence enhancement. The idea here is that treatment, that is psychotherapy-based treatment for BPAD, should be tailored to the needs of the older adult. And especially considering that older adults with bipolar disorder are much less likely to have adequate social supports and much more likely to have disabilities. Therapy which is based on reducing the burden of disability and focused on the family, involving the family as a whole rather than just working with the individual, might serve you better. Now, while this is a broad overview, there are many things about which we simply do not know enough. We do not know if there is actually enough evidence for the theory of a vascular bipolar disorder, like we have for a vascular depressive disorder. We also do not know where neuroprogression ends and dementia begins. So while following up somebody with BPD over the lifespan, it might be very difficult to differentiate whether the deficits are because of BPD or if the person is now going into dementia. And where it falls on the types of late life bipolar disorder. For example, most of our literature is based on type 1. We don't know enough about type 2 and cyclothymia in older adults. But we're hoping that these are areas we might know more about in times to come. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Megita, for the lucid presentation. If people have any doubts, they can ask through the chat. We'll unmute you and then you can ask the question. There are a few questions in YouTube Live. Shall we take up those questions, sir?
Yeah.
So one of the questions asked by Dr. Neil Halim is that if a person presents for the first time in late life with manic episode and OC symptoms, and on frontal assessment battery only abstraction is affected, rest is normal, how to proceed?
Geeta?
Can I clarify about OC symptoms? Because again, if you're looking at somebody with a cheerful mood and with repetitive behaviors, ruling out a frontotemporal dementia might be high on your list, particularly because the frontotemporal dementias in the initial stages are not likely to have clear cognitive deficits. You might find some changes in executive functions, some changes in social cognition. But then again, this is something which would require detailed clarification and a longitudinal follow-up, because the best way to differentiate a dementia from a BPD is to look at the person over years.
And if there are classical OC symptoms, I mean, OC symptoms can manifest in bipolar disorder, although more common in depression, we know they can manifest in mania. I think the management still is focused more on a mood stabilization, particularly when you see somebody in a manic phase, rather than quickly prescribing an antidepressant, because it might worsen the course of bipolar disorder. Nonetheless, like Megita pointed out, mania for the first time in elderly itself is a problem. On top of that, you also have OC symptoms, then you have to look for other, conditions such as frontotemporal dementia. But I don't know whether we can make too much of interpretation about just one aspect of neuropsychological functioning, because, it's hard to differentiate neuropsychological functioning impairments in elderly, how much it is because of age, how much is because of, comorbid psychiatric illness, or whether it is harbinger of a later development of a, dementia, we don't know. But I think maybe such patients ought to be followed up more frequently, and the more frequent cognitive assessment may be required. Any other questions?
There is another question by the same person. If a patient is a known case of bipolar affective disorder who is maintained well on valproate and now has a history of hypertension and obstructive sleep apnea, the patient develops a recurrent hyponatremia irrespective of the antihypertensive drug used. So how do we manage such a case? Essentially, valproate and hypertension, probably also obesity, now also has hyponatremia.
Hyponatremia.
Yeah.
Ideally, manage hyponatremia, because there is very little treatment option available for BPD which does not cause hyponatremia.
Yeah, the risk of hyponatremia with valproate is much less compared with SSRIs and with carbamazepine probably. But yes, I mean, it's not unknown. Okay, valproate can cause hyponatremia, but I think the most important thing is to explore the reason for hyponatremia, whether it is valproate induced or there are other reasons for hyponatremia. Now, if valproate is the offending agent, and then I think you'll have to look for other drugs, obviously.
How about starting them on a probably second generation antipsychotic like lurasidone?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. There are other options, but considering the fact that this person is an excellent response to valproate, and bipolar disorder is not an easy disorder to treat, I think one should be very mindful of withdrawing it.
And also, I think that hyponatremia should not be a contraindication to a drug which acts well. So the best thing to do would be to treat the hyponatremia and also continue valproate if that's
And if there are any other medicines contributing to hyponatremia, that also needs to be looked into.
I think 2 questions in the chat. Shall I take them?
Dr. Vaibhavi, can you unmute yourself and ask the question?
Hello, sir. Good evening. Wonderful presentation, ma'am. Really nice slides. Every slide had a lot of take-home message. My question is, we do have a patient here who had presented at around 60 odd years with episode of mania with no prior psychiatric illness. However, he was prescribed medications. He hardly took medications for 1 or 2 months and stopped. Later on, he had a remission for around 1 to 2 years, and he only presented for the next episode. So my question is, if the first episode needs to be treated, what should be the duration, or if untreated, would it come back to baseline within what time? Thank you.
I don't think the duration of treatment changes much in late life bipolar disorders. So just as in the first episode in young people, you might want to treat the person at least for a duration of 1 to 2 years for the first episode. The episode is likely to remit by itself just like it does in younger people, but you're much more likely to have recurrent episodes.
Yeah, I mean, how long the untreated manic episode lasts in the elderly is very hard to say, but there may be some tendency for chronicity, but I think we can go only by adult data right now. And the issue of prophylaxis, in elderly is something which is not very different from what we discussed in other age groups also. But if late onset bipolar disorder is a recurrent illness, then I think one has to think of a continued treatment, what drug you want to choose, how long to give. I think you can only extrapolate from adult data. I think once you start a medication, you may have to give it indefinitely. However, like we exercise some caution when people come with first episode mania in other age groups, the current recommendations are any episode of mania requires indefinite prophylaxis. But there are some guidelines who allow you to be a little more circumspect, discuss the issue with family, because lifelong treatment is always a challenge. Like, for example, the episode is very, very severe, uncontrollable. You have to use, large dose of antipsychotics, or maybe use ECT, or although late onset, there's a strong family history of bipolar disorder. There are certain other situations which compel you to really think of a prophylaxis even in the first episode. But on the other hand, if it's a very mild episode of mania or hypomania, and prophylaxis is a challenge because you have to monitor medication, serum lithium levels, and blah blah. Then I think one has to make a very considered decision of discussing with the family of the possibility of a relapse. But otherwise, long-term treatment is the gold standard for all forms of bipolar disorder across all age groups.
Also, that we have evidence of at least 40 years of follow-up in young people with BPAD who have become now geriatric. And even there, relapse is the norm rather than the exception. Similarly, 10 years of follow-up data in late onset BPADs also tend to show that only 16% never have an episode in their life. Most of them tend to have recurrent episodes or residual symptoms.
It is a matter of weighing again the risks and benefits. If late onset bipolar disorder is associated with unbearable side effects, drug interactions, and the episode was mild, you might want to take a chance, but you'll have to decide on an individualized basis. But the general rule is that bipolar disorder requires maintenance treatment. There is one from Niman's experience of how long lithium continued without break in this group and ended up with what?
Diabetes insipidus, I think. Nephrogenic diabetes insipidus.
I don't know. I am not aware of any Niman's experience.
Dr. Muthukrishnan, can you unmute your mic and ask the question?
Yes, the same thing. How long? See, she was saying about 40 years of continued therapy in the younger group. In this group, the elderly group, how long the lithium have been given in humans, and you have seen the incidence of NDI with this nephrogenic diabetes
There is, Muthukrishnan, there is no formal data, to be honest. I don't think anybody here has a special interest in this age group other than this presentation. So I don't think we have a proper data as such. I think what Megita is talking about is data from data elsewhere. So I'm sure there are patients who are on mood stabilizers here also, but I don't think you've done any formal analysis. And if this can give an idea to somebody, they can start looking at it and see what has really happened to these people, because we see a lot of bipolar disorder patients.
That being said, nephrogenic diabetes insipidus is much more likely in older adults when compared to younger adults, and that is from data across the world. And it tends to occur fairly quickly in older adults. It also tends to occur at lower doses, which is one of the arguments for treating with lithium at subtherapeutic doses, because 0.2 to 0.4 might maintain remission and also might reduce the burden on the kidneys.
I'm not sure, Megita, how good is the data that 0.2 to 0.4 serum lithium level is good enough to prevent mood episodes?
It's not great.
It's more in favor of side effect profile, but maybe on the lower end, even in adults, 0.5 to 0.6 is recommended by some people if the side effects are more. But I'm not sure, less than 0.5 milliequivalent per liter, how good it is in elderly, but I don't know. I don't think there is too much of a controlled data on this kind of information. Matthew says neuropsychological testing may not be clinically indicated early in treatment if the person has a clear, I agree, mania. Also, neuropsychological test findings are difficult to interpret. Yes, they're not specific to disorder. I fully agree.
And we should not really be treating, doing a neuropsychological assessment when somebody is in the middle of a mood episode, or ideally even in 6 months after the episode, because it does take 6 months for some of the changes to come back to baseline.
Matthew is asking, isn't diabetes insipidus an early side effect rather than long-term side? Early side effect, you see more of polyuria, not necessarily a fully formed diabetes insipidus. Megita, you can correct me. I think you'll know better than me.
I also thought that diabetes insipidus tends to be a long-term.
Yeah, it is a long-term use. What happens in the early phase is, just increase in the urinary frequency and thirst, but does not necessarily amount to diabetes insipidus. But I've seen many patients pour on lithium over many years and then develop after several years of using lithium. I don't know. You can check that once again.
There are a few more questions in YouTube. Dr. Krishnavasan Venkata asks, role of long-acting injectables in treatment or non-compliance in the case of late onset mania. What is your take on that?
Again, can be used. The only reason we are not recommending it right now is because we don't have enough data from RCTs using antipsychotics in BPD in the elderly. And what little RCTs we do have are sub-analysis from, say, the study, the STEP PD, Boulder 1, Boulder 2. And that is why quetiapine has been offered. That said, antipsychotics are effective in treatment of BPD. It's only that we're worried about the risk of cardiac and also mortality.
Maybe the neurological side effects, elderly also more prone to neurological side effects, tardive dyskinesia. So the available liponeuroleptics, such as fluphenazine and haloperidol may not be preferable because of higher risk for TD, but something like olanzapine is a problem because many of these people may have diabetes. That boils down to using risperidone and paliperidone.
Flupentixol is also something we have found.
Which one?
Flupentixol.
Flupentixol also is a conventional antipsychotic, typical antipsychotic. So I don't think there is any data on this because even the data in adults also is limited, but talked about more than actually the data. There is some data, risperidone constant and paliperidone can improve the course of bipolar disorder simply because we improve the compliance, but we don't have any data in elderly. But yes, antipsychotics do work. Which antipsychotics to be used, you need to exercise discretion, keeping in mind several factors.
In continuation with the antipsychotic discussion we are having, Dr. Rakesh asks, what is the safety and efficacy of lurasidone, and what is the effective and recommended dosage of lurasidone in bipolar disorder in the late onset?
For any drug in the geriatric population, the idea is start low and go slow. So you would want to start at 25% to 50% of the adult dose. So that means the median dose of risperidone is 2 to 4 mg, olanzapine 5 to 10 mg, lurasidone say 20 to 60 mg. Start at a lower dose and check for frequent adverse effects and perhaps go slower in the up titration. That being said, you can aim at the normal adult dose, just that the titration should be slower. And then once during titration you find that there is an adequate response, you can stop at that dose.
Yeah, I mean, and what Megita is saying is kind of a common sense clinical practice because of the pharmacokinetic problems in the elderly. But I don't think there is any published data on lurasidone in geriatric population.
No.
But I think general precautions have to be exercised whenever any medications are given in the elderly.
Dr. Hari asks, any insights on more prevalence of secondary mania in the elderly? Is it due to more clarity of the same underlying pathologies of BPAD, or is it because of different etiological factors involved?
Well, secondary mania is by definition are secondary to other medical conditions. So they are not the usual bipolar disorders.
I think also the question is, are we finding more organic causes because we're looking for more organic causes?
Not really, actually. Not really. I mean, see, it is not a convention here, but elsewhere in the other parts of the world, most bipolar patients also get imaged quite regularly.
Mm-hmm.
So there is no evidence that early onset bipolar disorders have less cognitive, less organic etiologies. Of course they have, but not because of we underscreen it. Not because we don't examine them enough. No, that's not the reason. The issue in elderly is that there are multiple issues. One is, of course, secondary manias, but like vascular factors and other factors do contribute to the situation. We don't know. Like white matter hyperintensities and many other things that Megita was referring to, obviously are more common in elderly than in younger onset patients.
With secondary mania, what you do have robust evidence about is the nature of the brain injury which causes it. So right hemispheric injuries, frontal subcortical disconnectivity, those are the kind of areas of the brain where you want to look at. Those are also areas which are very metabolically active and much more likely to be vulnerable to any sort of injury, a stroke, a tumor, as you grow older.
Dr. Ranganath Kulkarni from Dharwad, he asked whether steroids-induced mania does it occur in those who are given a parenteral or oral route.
Anything which undergoes first-pass metabolism will spread all across the body, so you can expect it to confidently cross the blood-brain barrier and cause.
Does it occur in those taking it for more than 1 week or less than 1 week? I mean, generally larger doses, longer periods, you are more likely to have mania. Ranganath, again, we are not going to get this kind of a data answer specifically, but we know that steroids can induce mania. So.
And we have had people who have had, say, 1 dose of steroid or 1 dose of amitriptyline and gone into mania. So we might not classically expect a dose-response relationship in steroid-induced mania. Yeah.
Again, we really don't have a systematic data on these kind of, most of these drug-induced psychiatric syndromes are basically from case reports and case series, and
Lithium, valproate, and quetiapine are the only drugs in which you have RCT data from the elderly.
Then Dr. Thomas has a question to Megita. How relevant is Akiskal's classification in the context of late life bipolar disorder, especially with regard to progression to dementia? And is bipolar disorder likely an independent risk factor for dementia?
So Akiskal's type 6 BPAD is BPAD which eventually leads on to dementia and has late onset. But that being said, neuropsychological studies have shown that the deficits are very different. So the deficits you see in a young person who then becomes old are predominantly dysexecutive and working memory. Similar deficits also in an old person who develops it for the first time. Whereas on the other hand, in an Alzheimer's, you have predominantly problems with learning, not really executive deficits. On the other hand, what you see in healthy older adults is basically just a slowing down of cognition with age. So while we're not sure where neuroprogression stops and dementia actually starts, it is likely that they are different disorders altogether.
But is it like schizophrenia? People say that it entails an enhanced risk for Alzheimer's dementia. His question is, does bipolar disorder also have a similar risk?
People with late onset BPD seem to have a higher risk of progression to dementia compared to healthy older adults. Also seem to have a higher risk when compared to even late onset depressive disorders. But again, that is observational data, so we don't really have robust comparison.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
I think one question in the middle about the use of aripiprazole as an alternative mood stabilizer. One RCT has looked at arip in older adults and found it is not inferior to mood stabilizers, but that's one small RCT.
There is one more question in YouTube. A patient who is a known case of bipolar but presented with a depressive episode in elderly age and has restlessness not relieved by 6 mg of lorazepam. He is treated for this restlessness is presumed to be restless leg syndrome. It is treated with pramipexole, but still needs repetitive hospitalization for restlessness. How to manage?
The question is restless leg syndrome in an elderly person with bipolar disorder.
And currently in depressive episode.
Currently in depressive episode. Okay, Megita?
Again, I think evaluation of exactly what the restlessness is, because depressions in elderly, whether unipolar or bipolar, tend to be agitated depression, or another alternative are drug-induced akathisias. But you also do have a fairly high prevalence of RLS in older adults.
But restless leg syndromes can also be due to psychotropics.
Yes.
SSRIs are known to cause, and antidepressants in general are known to cause restless leg syndrome. So there are multiple ETRs for restless syndrome. I think that needs to be, if it is drug induced, then I think one has to think of an alternative medication for treating restless syndrome. I have one patient like this. I don't know what to do.
Should we start them on SSRI because it is bipolar affective disorder? Should we concentrate on mood stabilization instead? Give only mood stabilizer. Probably not an antipsychotic, but probably valproate or.
Well, how good the valproate is as antidepressant in bipolar depression, we don't know. I mean, generally the
Lamotrigine, for example.
Yes, lamotrigine is an option if it's a bipolar depression. It takes a long time. Lithium is a good option. Lithium is a good option for all phases of bipolar disorder. Otherwise, you will have to think of atypicals, which do not really have akathisia and other kind of side effects. Basically, it boils down to using quetiapine, because lorazepam also is quite high in terms of akathisia, and olanzapine has its own problems. But quetiapine is an option. Otherwise, you will have to stabilize on lithium. And if the depression does not improve, then you have the option of either trying quetiapine or lorazepam, because lorazepam does not give any protection against mania. You need one mood stabilizer. Quetiapine may be a good option because it's probably works for both phases of mania.
Other things such as nutritional anemia, which can contribute to RMS.
There are multiple charges for restless syndrome that needs to be investigated.
Peripheral neuropathies, anything which you might think might be more prevalent in older adults.
I think that comes to the end of the questions. Shiv Shankar has asked a question in YouTube. How good is vortioxetine in bipolar depression? Not specific to elderly. Comparatively, a very new drug, a year-old infant. What does the evidence say?
I thought there were RCTs in mild and moderate depression, perhaps.
Vortioxetine in bipolar depression?
No, unipolar. Unipolar, I know that
bipolar. Shiv Shankar has asked about using vortioxetine in bipolar depression.
I don't know. Lakshmi was trying to do a trial and he asked me a couple of years back if I was interested in vortioxetine trial in depression, but I am not sure if there is any published data on that, vortioxetine in bipolar depression. It seems to be a reasonably good antidepressant like any other SSRI in unipolar depression, but I'm not sure in bipolar depression.
I think cost is the offending agent here for that.
So, Matthew sir has noted that asinapine is also another consideration that we used to give.
Somehow Asnapen fell out of favor in India. What happened is, I mean, at least the drug company people say that patients used to spit it rather than keep it under the mouth. Although it was initially brought into market saying that it's much useful to give people with poor compliance, but it has to be kept under your tongue for some time. That itself is a problem. Somebody has to supervise it. And many people complained of unpleasant sensation in the mouth, isn't it? Somehow.
We were also a part of the clinical trial for asinapine when I was a student. So the drug we had got for the clinical trials actually would dissolve in less than 5 seconds. But when it came to the market, it would take about a minute for it to dissolve. So many people would, the ones which we got were flavored, strawberry, vanilla flavored in the trials. But when it came out, there were no, even though they said probably that it was flavored, but all that people would get was metallic flavor. Like iron, zinc. So people stopped using that. Many of our patients whom we started it on complained about this.
We had one patient who discontinued asinapine simply because he said the tablet takes 30 minutes to dissolve. So I don't know, but patients don't like it much.
Yes.
Nutritional mania, any evidence in late life? Nutritional deficiencies are more commonly associated with depression rather than mania. That said, there seems to be some anecdotal and observational evidence on hypoglycemia as a triggering factor for BPAD. But as such, not hypoglycemia inducing it, but the more hypoglycemia episodes you have, the more often relapses seem to occur.
Shiv Shankar says that, thank you, sir. We had one elderly treatment-resistant bipolar depression who responded well to vortioxetine and lamotrigine combination.
Possible. I mean, anything can happen.
I think the problem is not a proof of efficacy, rather, but of finding the drugs that you can tolerate best and are safer.
Pellagra is not likely to cause mania, it's more likely to be associated with psychosis.
There is one more question in YouTube, sir. What are the preferred drugs for decreased sleep in the elderly of any cause and specific to bipolar affective disorder, whether benzodiazepines or low-dose second-generation antipsychotics?
Come again, what is the?
Preferred drug for reduced sleep in the elderly in bipolar affective disorder, whether benzodiazepines can be given or low-dose second-generation antipsychotics will only help.
As a sedative, it is best not to continue any sedative for a long period of time, simply because both antipsychotics and benzodiazepines reduce bone calcification, cause osteoporosis. There is going to be gait ataxia, a risk of falls. That said, once a person is in an acute episode, you want to give them whatever you can to help them calm down. And then later, once they do, you can taper and stop drugs. So there's nothing wrong with using benzodiazepine during the episode. The question is of tapering off the antipsychotic as well as the benzodiazepine as quickly as you can once they reach remission.
Yeah, but benzodiazepines in higher doses can cause confusion and other kind of cognitive difficulties. In addition, if they also have a comorbid respiratory problems, sometimes benzodiazepines can be but not in a small doses with 0.5 mg of clonazepam, 0.5 mg of alprazolam is unlikely to really cause respiratory suppression. But generally the general physicians and pulmonologists are very scared of using benzodiazepines because of its effect on respiration. But otherwise, I think they can be used judiciously. Sometimes, like 50 mg of quetiapine, people use it for sleep if they are indicated, otherwise. But
another potential alternative is trazodone. Trazodone and mirtazapine can be used in low doses as sedatives and do not really have much of a risk of switch.
I mean, if somebody is on antipsychotic, sedative antipsychotic that itself sometimes takes care of the sleep.
Right.
You may not need to add anything else. But a small dose of benzodiazepines may not really harm if used judiciously and monitored.
They asked the reason behind that was probably benzodiazepines are known to cause paradoxical inhibition in the elderly. If benzodiazepines are to be used, if benzodiazepines are to be used, which one to be preferred with respect to paradoxical inhibition and not liver function?
That's true. I mean, see, these are all written about side effects, but I don't think they are so common. Actually speaking, they're not so common. But if you are using it for sleep, you obviously prefer short-acting benzodiazepines, right? I mean, so that sedation is not carried on to the next day.
I don't think there's any difference between the benzodiazepines in causing paradoxical activation.
Yeah.
On the other hand, what you do see is that the more cognitive deficits there are at baseline, the more likely there is to be benzodiazepine-induced confusion and paradoxical activation both. So that could be maybe a guiding factor.
Matthew sir says better not use,
Haloperidol.
for example, haloperidol with lorazepam for acute mania sedation. Use only haloperidol.
The emphasis is on using monotherapy as far as possible in bipolar disorders in older adults, and using 2 or more drugs orally or parenterally only if required.
Okay.
I think that comes to the end of the session, sir. Do you have any final words to say, sir?
Well, thank you. I think it was an excellent presentation, quite succinct, and she covered all the possible areas that can be covered. Thank you, Megita, for a nice presentation, also good discussion. Thank you, Chetan, for giving me an opportunity to share this session in bipolar disorder.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Megita. Thank you, sir. Matthew sir has another comment. Long-acting benzodiazepines like diazepam are not recommended at all in the elderly. Also thank Matthew sir for his active presentation, active participation in the discussion. It was a very lively discussion also in there. So thank you, everybody. We also like to thank Linux Laboratories Chennai for their academic grant through which we are running this program. Kindly subscribe to our YouTube channel Nimans Indians to receive notifications and also watch other videos of all the sessions till now. So we'll meet you 2 weeks later on a Saturday on the next presentation. Thank you, one and all. We'll be ending the session now.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.